So yeah, this is the title of our project that's been going on for I guess 5 years now, and Jason Fisher is the lead scientist on this project. And in the past, I think Jason has talked to you about or to this group about some of the other components of this project. I'm not going to cover all this in the talk. I'm really going to focus on the population density part and some methodological work we've been doing to try and get a good estimate of deer population density in the Boreal. So this is work in progress. Some of it's pretty hot off the laptop, so definitely keen for any feedback or discussion. Yeah, we're pretty excited about it. Hopefully not in too much of a geeky stats way, but yeah, we'll see what you think of some of it. Before I get into it, I just want to acknowledge that a lot of people at AITF and Alberta Environment have been involved in this project. As I said, it's been going for about 5 years, and a lot of groups like AUPRF have generously funded the work. So I don't need to spend much time to this group talking about why we're interested in white-tailed deer. There's been work by Stan Boudin and his students like Kim Daw and Dave Latham showing that they've been increasing, expanding into the Boreal, increasing in number, and that presents a real problem for caribou as they, through apparent competition, where they increase wolf numbers, which has a detrimental effect on caribou. So, you know, there's a need to basically, that sets the stage for the importance of deer, but we really don't have a lot of great information on their ecology or population dynamics in the Boreal region. So that was why the Boreal Deer Project got started, really with a goal to try and improve our understanding of deer habitat use and deer population dynamics in this region. And the project involved two main sources of data collection. So we ran a grid of 62 camera traps, which are these black dots across the map here, for 3 years, starting in October 2011 and running through to October 2014. So I should first set the context. The study area is about a 3,000 square kilometer area north of the Cold Lake Weapons Range. It's the Christina Lake, Winifred Lake area. So over the 3 years, we got a data set of more than 60,000 camera trap days. So quite a large camera trapping data set. And the other main methodological tool was GPS collaring. So 40 female deer were collared over the course of the study, generating more than 100,000 locations. So these are the two main sources of data that we've been using to try and address some different questions about deer ecology. And as I said, I'm going to focus on the density part of things. And often ungulates their density is assessed through aerial surveys. We want to be able to know how many are in an area and how their populations are changing. But with deer, as most of you probably know from flying around these Boreal habitats, they can be quite hard to count. You know, they get nestled in there in the thick conifer forest, and the detectability can be quite low. So what we were interested in exploring is what we can get out of a camera trap grid or camera array, and whether that can be used effectively to estimate deer density. Obviously, camera traps are being increasingly used in a whole range of wildlife surveys, but not too many looking at density of unmarked species, as we call them, like white-tailed deer. So we definitely know that we can get lots of pictures of deer. This graph shows sort of the summary of our many detections of deer that we got over the 3 years of study. So over 17,000 deer detections over the course of the study. And this graph just shows the summed count of individual deer events on each day of the study. So this would be October 2011 back here, and this is the count across all the camera traps that were running right up to the end of the study in October 2014. So, you know, lots of deer detections, as I said, and some interesting patterns going on here. Certainly, we can see these seasonal fluctuations. So I've put blue shading to represent the December to March winter periods. And you can see many more deer detections in the summers and spring periods than in the winter periods. And also over the course of our study, if you sort of smooth out some of this noise, you do see a bit of a declining trend in deer detections over that time. So this is an index of what we call relative abundance, a detection rate, and it gives us some interesting patterns, but the question is really, does this tell us about what their absolute abundance, what their true numbers are doing? And we're quite interested in that problem because ecologically, if you look at our study period, we had some interesting weather patterns. So this graph over here shows the snow accumulation on the ground from the Fort Mac Environment Canada weather station. And the average maximum over the last 30 years has been around this 30 centimeter level, which is the level we got in the first winter of our study. And you can see it doubled in the second winter, which was a very cold, very high snowfall year. And the third winter was pretty harsh too. And so this kind of coincides with these reductions in deer images we're getting over the course of the study, and certainly in these harsh winters. So that raises the interesting question, especially in the context of whether climate change is restricting deer expansion of the Boreal, as to whether the population itself is really responding to these kind of winter conditions. But the problem is we know that in an index of relative abundance, like a detection rate, that movement is a confounding factor. I say confounding because I mean confounding with the number of deer. So this is just some graphs to illustrate from our telemetry data that we've seen that deer step length changes quite significantly from the winter months into the summer months or the snow-free months. So they're moving larger distances. Their home ranges are larger in spring, summer, fall relative to winter. So they're restricting their movements in winter, which means they have less chance of passing cameras. So if I go back here, it's hard to say how much is a change in numbers of deer and how much is a change in their movements. And this is a general problem in terms of inferring something about absolute abundance or density from an index like a camera trapping. And so that's led us to think about different analytical techniques we could use to try and both account for the number of deer on a landscape and how they're moving within that landscape to try and get a more robust estimate of density for that landscape. So what we've turned to try this out with cameras is a class of models called Spatial Capture-Recapture models. These have become increasingly popular in recent years thanks to some groundbreaking work by people like Murray Efford and Andy Royal, who's the lead author on this book that came out in the last year or so. And spatial capture-recapture models are similar to ordinary capture-recapture models, except for they have a spatially explicit component. So they account for the location of traps, and they use that spatial information to try and model the movement of individuals that are being recaptured. So the data are essentially like a regular type of capture-recapture approach where you have each individual that's been captured, you develop a detection history for it across sampling occasions, but you also treat each trap individually instead of lumping them together, as has been traditionally done in these sort of non-spatial models. But this approach has been shown to work very well. It's typically, in the context of camera traps, it's typically used on species like these leopards or tigers or things that have these natural markings where you can identify individuals and know that you're tracking the same individual as it moves across your camera stations. Things get a little trickier when you're working with a species like white-tailed deer that don't have these nice patches or patterns to help you consistently identify individuals. So there's an extension of the spatial capture-recapture models that we call spatial count models for these unmarked species. And essentially what they do is they treat these encounter histories here that I mentioned as unobserved or latent variables. So they're implicit in the model, but we don't have the data for them. And it estimates activity centers from the spatial correlation and counts. So if you envision a grid cell of sampling points like cameras, these little dots all across here, and the size of the circles represents the number of counts that particular sampling point detects, the correlation in those counts can be used along with an assumption about detection probability and how that changes with the distance away from a sampling point for an animal. And together, those can be used to try and estimate how many activity centers there are and where they are across this grid. So these green areas would be areas where, because of the correlation and counts around those points, the model would estimate that an individual lives here, maybe a few individuals live here. And so this type of model can be used to basically count up the number of different activity centers across a sampling area. And the parameters that we estimate are this detection probability at the actual point, and then a distance decay function of how the detection probability declines as an animal's home range center or activity center moves away from that point. That's called sigma, and that essentially relates to home range size of an animal. So there's a bit of a middle ground between the fully individually identified spatial capture-recapture and then these unmarked spatial count models I just described, and that's called a spatial Mark-Resight model, where you have information on some of the population. So in our case, we have the collared deer, who sometimes nicely walk in front of a camera for us. And this is just a sort of a rough thing I took out of my ArcGIS without making it look very nice. But this is individual deer bouncing around here, and this is a camera point in the center. So just a little circle to give you maybe a radius around the camera. And so that you can see in the course of their activities, these collared deer might encounter the camera trap. And so we have an encounter history or a record of detections of some of the individuals that we know, along with a bunch of individuals that didn't happen to have collars, so we don't know them. So essentially what we can do is combine this model for the marked individuals with the unmarked individuals, and we can also capitalize on the fact that we don't just have to coarsely estimate their home range and movement from this function. We know where they moved, these individuals, because we had them collared. So this is what we're going for, is to try and apply these spatial count and spatial Mark-Resight models to the deer data set. And just a brief note about model assumptions. So George Buck said, all models are wrong, some are useful. Of course, they all come with assumptions, and you might be thinking, well, this model is probably pretty heavy on assumptions because you're trying to get high-quality density information from, relatively sparse information about the individuals. But just to point out that the model does make assumptions about demographic closure, so that you're not having a lot of deer die or be born during your estimation period. They're not moving all across the place, and that your detection probability function is a reasonable description of their movement behavior. So these kinds of assumptions make us think about what kind of data we're throwing into the model. I'll talk a bit more about that, but basically we did things like not include fawns because they're quite dependent on their moms. And then we tried to choose estimation periods that might satisfy some of these model assumptions. So that brings in this kind of complicated graph that I'll spend a couple minutes just explaining here. This served the purpose of us choosing which periods during our full 3-year study we were going to use to try and test these models and estimate deer density. So what we have here on the x-axis at the bottom is, again, our days of study. So from October 2011 through to, this actually goes to June 2015 because we still had data on the collared deer. And the y-axis is each of the 40 collared deer. So each line represents one deer. The black line represents when they had their collar, so when their movements were monitored. So, ideally you'd have black lines all throughout the study, but of course, collars fail, deer die like the day after you put the collar on, or, eaten by a wolf, not because you put it on too tight or whatever. But, so we have this kind of messy data set when you break it down this way. And what I try to do is identify times when we would have our best chance at satisfying model assumptions. The pink dots on some of these lines are when those deer were detected by cameras. So that's when we got the additional information that combines the telemetry and the camera. And then I overlaid the winter bars on here again. So essentially we tried 4 estimates here. The first one was in December 2012, January 2013, because that's the only time where we have an independent estimate of deer density. SRD did an aerial survey to try and estimate deer density at that time. So we wanted to compare those 2 estimates. After that, I went for some of the periods that are richer in our data set, more deer collared and more camera detections of those deer. And then finally, I went back to do sort of a comparison across one of these winters. So I'll go through those in a bit more detail now. So the first question, which relates to this first period of estimation, was how does this camera estimate compare to an aerial survey? Are we getting a roughly similar estimate so that we can feel like, hey, this method has a chance? And I'd say the answer was yes. So in the aerial survey, estimated about 0.15 deer per square kilometer. And our camera survey was our camera estimate was in a similar ballpark. And if I just pop back here again, this was during a period where we didn't really have collared deer. A lot of the initial collars failed, and this was our next collaring period. So this was one of these unmarked models with no information on the collared deer. And it estimated, a bit higher of an estimate, 0.21 deer per square kilometer, which kind of made us happy because we are thinking detectability from the aerial surveys is low, so maybe the cameras are actually picking up more of the population. But of course, you'll notice the confidence. These are 90% confidence intervals because that's what the aerial survey reported. You can see they're quite huge. So that gave us a bit of a pause. And if you look at the model results, this is from the camera model, and this is called the posterior density. I completely forgot to mention how we implement these models. They're Bayesian Markov chain Monte Carlo models. I was going to spare you some of the gory details, but they're quite computationally intensive. They can take from sort of days to weeks to run. And at the end of it, you get this distribution called your posterior estimate, and you want it to be a nice looking distribution. And when you get these funny bumpy tails, you have some potential convergence problems. So perhaps not unexpectedly, this model is not behaving perfectly. It's giving us quite a wide confidence interval, and it's a little bit sensitive to the initial conditions you put into it. So we thought, okay, well, encouraging, but the unmarked model maybe isn't the best, or it can be perhaps improved on. So we wanted to go now to incorporating the telemetry data. So back to that crazy graph, this is my second estimation period where we actually had 10 collared deer that were interacting with the cameras, getting detected by some of the cameras. And so we could incorporate the movement information for those deer and their detections and feed that in with the unmarked component of the model. And we get another estimate with what I would say is a nicer looking distribution and narrower confidence intervals. But if you remember my first number, the estimate was roughly 0.22 deer per square kilometer. And this is almost an order of magnitude lower. Of course, it's a different time period. This was done sort of spring, summer 2014, but that's kind of crazy. Like, yeah, nice tight confidence intervals, but this is a huge decline. So we're wondering, is this real or is this a modeling artifact? Did the population crash over that winter? Or do we need to pause and think about the model a bit more? And going for the latter option, I realized that during this period, because it was kind of a spring period, April, June, some of the deer were in the middle of their seasonal movements. So they kind of had a wintering range and moving back to a summering range. So I should explain the blue dots here are the camera locations. Red dots are telemetry locations for the deer. And the black lines are the minimum convex polygon home ranges. So some of the deer, stayed nice and close in one area, but some of them were doing these huge movements. So that goes back to the model assumptions I put up there, and that's a clear violation of this idea that you don't have these large migratory movements. We did, in fact, have those during this sampling period. So what I did was I switched the estimate from this spring period to a bit later in the year, July to August. And looking at the telemetry data, we could see we no longer had some of these sort of shoulder season migratory movements. And that's this estimate here. This was the original estimate, the unmarked model. This is the telemetry Spatial Mark-Resight model. And this is this anomalous one that included the migratory movements. So this shows us a couple things. One is that the estimate seems to have slightly tighter confidence intervals, although still quite wide, which I guess isn't surprising considering we only have 10 marked deer among over 1,000 estimated in that area. But it also shows us the model's quite sensitive to these movements, and this is also made evident by looking at the sigma parameter, which is the scale parameter I mentioned earlier, which essentially relates to home range. And if you translate that into home range size, that middle model in the spring estimated like a 600 square kilometer home range for white-tailed deer, which is huge. So the model was really sensitive to those migratory movements, and that's sort of a cautionary note for us to make sure we don't violate that kind of assumption in this modeling. So the last question, the fourth estimation period we wanted to look at is, if we look across one of these severe winters, do we see this change in deer density in the study area? Does that index of relative abundance kind of give us a true indication of a decline in the deer? So we estimated, we used the Spatial Mark-Resight model to estimate a 2013 density estimate to compare with that 2014. And really, there's no indication. I mean, given these large confidence intervals, there's no indication of any change in the population across that winter. So as long as we trust these models, that suggests to us that relying on that index of relative abundance would be misleading. It's probably more reflecting the restricted movements of deer during the winter season. And then, in fact, that severe winter hasn't really knocked back the number of deer in the area. So yeah, just to wrap this up, I think from this sort of exploration, we feel pretty excited that the camera grids and these spatial count or spatial mark-resight models do hold a lot of promise for estimating density of what we call unmarked species like boreal deer. But the models are quite sensitive to violation of assumptions like movement behavior. So you want to avoid these periods when deer are changing from a winter range to a summer range. And from those models, we didn't see any evidence of a population decline over the winter. There's more need for model testing, and we also want to try and apply it to other species. The same camera grid has detected collared wolves, collared black bears, and caribou that other projects have had collared in the area. So we're talking with them now about trying to apply the methods to different species with different movement patterns and see if we get reasonable estimates. And ideally, the real test of this method is to try and keep comparing it with independent estimates that we trust, which is challenging because I started out by saying the aerial surveys are hard for deer. So it's a little bit challenging that way. But I think as long as the models are giving us reasonable results, then it's definitely worth continuing to pursue them and maybe try and apply them in different areas.